As Jesse just said, I am Christina Taylor. I am a comics librarian, and I have put here on the screen for you, there's a link to my presentation as well as a sheet of annotated resources in case you want to reference this information later. But I'll just kind of begin by giving you a little bit of information about myself. As I said, I'm Christina Taylor. I am the Youth Services Consultant here at the Texas State Library and Archives Commission. And in this role, I support youth services throughout Texas. And so I make sure that libraries in Texas have the information and the resources that they need to support their communities in regards to youth services. There are also a couple of other hats that I've worn, specifically speaking to me styling myself as a comics librarian and kind of the area in which I have been able to develop myself really in this area of expertise. So currently I serve on the board of directors for the nonprofit organization. It's a nonprofit comics advocacy organization, Reading with Pictures. And in that role, I serve as the vice president of social media. I am also the co-founder of the Central Texas Teen and Kids Comic Con. And this is a free all ages con for school age children that's hosted by the Library Services Department at Round Rock Independent School District, where I was formerly an educator. And the last, I guess, hat that I wear is that I am an alumna of the Texas Library Association's Texas Mavericks graphic novel reading list, and we'll be talking about that more. I started out in that position as a 2-year committee member term, and then actually it was a 3-year term, but I succeeded that and went on to chair the committee. And so that has been a fantastic experience and really has kind of set me on this path. So as Jesse mentioned, just a couple of things that we're going to talk about today is that I'm going to start out with some basic concepts, really focusing on kind of terminology, what's important and what's not important, as well as kind of the literacy connections as far as benefits that readers get from reading comics and graphic novels, as well as countering pushback when you have those community members, those stakeholders who just really are struggling with seeing the value of having it in a collection in the library. And then some selection criteria. This is not as difficult as it used to be when I first started. We have a lot better selection aids, kind of the traditional ones that we're used to using as tools of our trade, are starting to carry more information and more helpful information about this format. And then some things to keep an eye out for is kind of what's on the horizon. I am also, in my personal life, a Barbie collector, and I feel like comics in graphic format have a lot in common with it in that way, as far as there's always something new. And if your thought is you're just looking for what's new, what's hot, more, you can easily get lost in the sea of infinite possibilities. So I'm going to give you some pointers as far as things that you can watch out for that are trending, but then also, how to help you narrow that down and kind of look at what you really be thoughtful about what you want to put in your collection. All right, so starting with basic terminology, some terms that you might see used in various different contexts when you're talking about the graphic format. You could hear them referred to as comics, you could hear them referred to as graphic novels, maybe sequential art, maybe graphica. And I will say, sure, there are nuances and there are different contexts associated with each one of them. But for our purposes, since we are talking kind of basic 101 information that you're looking at, those terms are largely interchangeable. I will generally use the term comics. Well, let me back up a little bit. The term that I use often changes depending upon my audience, depending on who I'm talking to and the level of discourse. So for example, if I'm talking to comic creators, I will often use the term comics. And I say this because there are some, especially those who have been in the comic sphere for a long time that are well established find the term graphic novel to be pretentious and even kind of offensive. And so they feel like, I've been doing this for a long time. When did we need to use this elevated term to talk about something, and that it wasn't valued until it got this new term? So I will often use the term comics if that is my audience. If I'm talking to library workers or educators, I frequently use the term graphic novels, just because that is kind of the current industry for us vocabulary. And so when you're having these conversations, especially if you're talking about the validity of having it in your collection and incorporating it into your program, part of what you want to do is signal that, like, obviously I'm not old and antiquated in my thinking and in my principles that I apply to librarianship. I am involved with, engaged with, understand the current discourse and the current thinking surrounding it. And so you want to make sure that you use terms that people are expecting that they associate with a level of currency and not something that they would think of as being out of date. And then if I was talking to, say, academics or theorists, I don't know if I ever had the chance to talk to, say, Scott McCloud, I might use the term sequential art or graphica, because in those circles, it's deemed more expansive. And that's really what they're looking for. And that the other terms, because of those nuances, are often viewed as being too restrictive and maybe don't cover the breadth of what they're talking about. So really, again, my terminology changes depending upon who my audience is and who and what we're talking about and the level of discussion there. For our purposes, I'm probably just going to say comics most of the time, because although I know graphic novels is the current industry vocabulary, it also can be very awkward depending upon what you're saying afterwards. And so it just kind of, comics, I find, for me, rolls off the tongue nice and smoothly, and then I can go on to make my next point. But like I said, for this level of conversation that we're having, largely those terms are interchangeable. Now, there is a difference, a fairly significant difference between Western-centric comics and manga. And again, this is a bit of a simplification, but we are talking on basic levels, so I don't want to get too in the weeds with this. But the primary exception to the statement I just made about those terms being largely interchangeable is when you're talking about manga. Manga is generally reserved for comics that hail from and are rooted in Japanese culture. And this is significant because it has a visible impact throughout the text. The way it is styled, the cultural significance, the topics, the way they're treated, it is pervasive, and it does make a significant difference. It is a different critter than kind of Western-centric comics. I will also say, kind of tangentially related, is the term anime. So in simplest terms, anime is Japanese animation. In fact, the term that we use for it, anime, comes from the French word for animated. It is the past participle of the verb to animate. But it's closely associated with manga, and many times anime films and TV shows are based on manga. So I will also say, as a caveat, although manga is not my area of expertise, like I tend to really, and I was just explaining this to someone else earlier today, is that I don't necessarily read a lot of superhero comics. I don't necessarily read a lot of serials. I read what's generally referred to as graphic novels or literary graphic novels. That's what I read most regularly. However, the benefits that reading things in a graphic format, whether it is manga or whether it is Western-centric comics, those benefits to reading and critical skills are largely the same. And so I'm going to use the term comics, but know that most of what I'm talking about also applies to manga. I have also given you, if you are really interested in manga and want to explore that more, I have given you some places where you can find additional information. And there are some fantastic manga head librarians out there who are way better versed in that area than I am. And I have given you, I want to say, information for at least about 3 of them off the top of my head, that I've had the honor to meet and work with, at least on a little level. All right. So we've kind of talked about what's, terms out there and what's important, but or what's not important really, is thinking about what is important. If you're new to thinking about and kind of discovering and exploring comics, the idea that comics is not a genre, it's a format. Comics and manga are not genres, they're formats. And so if you think about it kind of like audiobooks or braille text or videos, although it can have some ramifications as to how the library chooses to store or display the comics, the main reason I emphasize this point is just the idea that they can take the form of every genre or type imaginable. And so especially when we're talking about pushback, or we're talking about community members who don't see the value in having it in a collection, one of the things people will say is they're like, well, it's not a genre that I like. And I'm like, that's fair. We all have things that we like and things that we don't like. And sometimes we connect with one type of storytelling in one format as opposed to another. But comics and manga are a format, they're not a genre. So it's not really fair to them or yourself to swear them off thinking that I don't like that genre, because they can come at any type. And so whether we're talking about adventures or classics or fantasy or horror or realistic or romance, mystery, even nonfiction, expository text, all of these can show up in a graphic format. So when you start thinking about that, you can't really say you don't like them because you don't like that format, or it was very difficult to make that. You maybe don't connect with a certain type of information in that particular format, but there's also a chance that you will connect with a different type of information in that format as well. Also, just being aware that thinking again about kind of manga and how that fits in with all of this, is that just like Western centric storytelling, whether it's prose or comics or or graphic format, there are specific terms that are associated with those. So different styles. Largely, when you're looking at manga, those terms kind of map to the target audience. And so it generally includes things like an age range, kind of gender identity, and the romantic orientation. I do have a set of resources in the handout called the Manga Toolkit that explains those in more detail. But if you are looking for a specific confluence of those things, then it tells you, okay, this style is going to be most appropriate for what you're looking for. There's also, like I said, additional resources in that handout. All right, so I've kind of touched on it a little bit, but just thinking about the benefits of reading things in a graphic format, of reading comics. So the first one is the idea that comics increases reading, and so people don't often think of that, but it really does. And one of the biggest reasons why is that, and I say kids here, but really readers, one of the biggest benefits is that they're very, very motivating. People want to read them. In my former life, and I didn't say this in my introduction, but in my former life, I was an educator, a public school educator. I was in the educational system for 22 years, 15 of which I spent teaching high school English. I cannot tell you how many times I have argued with students in Texas about reading, especially when we're talking about reading the curriculum, we're reading the canon, all those things that have an article with a capital T in front of them. Making sure they have those skills. And how many times I've had students tell me they don't like reading, they haven't enjoyed it. And because of how I, the the role I was playing in education at that time, I didn't often get to put a text in front of them that they did want to read. Sometimes they found enjoyment in it unexpectedly, but I didn't often get to offer them something that they actually wanted to read. And that was one of my favorite things about being a school librarian, is that most of the time I got to connect people with reading that they enjoyed. And that is such a huge motivating factor. So a lot of times, readers can find a big solid page of text intimidating or possibly overwhelming. And that could be for any number of reasons, especially your struggling readers, but really it could be, at any given point, we could all be struggling for whatever reason. We're not necessarily just talking about learning differences. It could be we're tired. It could be the subject matter that we're looking at doesn't interest us. It could be that we find it difficult to take in information about this. It's that new to us and we're learning everything. Any number of reasons. We could all be struggling readers at some point or another, but struggling readers, for whatever reason, definitely find this huge wall of text of prose to be intimidating, overwhelming. So what comics do is they break up that text into manageable chunks. And that is huge. Rather than reading pages and pages of prose, you're reading manageable chunks. And on top of that, that manageable chunk is supported by visual storytelling. You have pictures there. And so by looking at both the text and the pictures, because neither one fully conveys the information on its own. By working on those two things, they support each other and they really do reinforce the conveyance of that idea with much fewer words and just not being as much of a bear, really, as a task. So both of those elements work together, and I will say this is the primary advantage over, and I will talk about this in a couple of different ways, but this is the primary advantage over things that are merely illustrated for decorative purposes. Having illustrations on there will break up the text, and so it gives you a bit of a brain break as well as visually a break. But if those illustrations aren't actually telling part of the story too, you're still, the majority of that information is being conveyed through the text, and so you're not getting that full benefit. But because these things work together, the reader has multiple clues that support their understanding. So they're getting the information, text in small chunks. They're receiving multiple clues as to how to make sense of it. It's broken up. All of this is very motivating, and it breaks down that intimidation factor, that feeling overwhelmed by just this massive slab of text. It also contributes to their enjoyment. Enjoyment is also huge. You don't have to fight with people to read something if they enjoy what they're reading. And again, take it from someone who was a high school English teacher for 15 years. I know this firsthand. What we're seeing is that when given the choice, learners of all ages are increasingly gravitating towards the comics format over traditional text. Libraries have found that once a graphic novel collection reaches kind of this critical mass, it often becomes the highest circulating collection in the entire library. And many times it will out-circulate all other collections you have, short of the most popular titles in your young adult section, which also speaks highly of young adult literature too, but that's a different conversation. But so just know that like it circulates. It's proof right there how much people are motivated by, enjoy, and want to read that. First and foremost, that's the biggest benefit. So again, increasing the quantity of reading. Sometimes you hear people argue that they're like, well, I want my kid to read a real book, is that I don't want them just reading comics. And we'll get to pushback again later, but or they're thinking it needs to be a bridge to reading something else. And first, I will say that if they're reading, let them read whatever it is they're reading. Like, don't, yeah, that can spiral into a whole negative situation by itself. But if they're reading, let them read. Um, and it could be a matter of at this point in their life, they are just reading comics. It could serve as a bridge later. Maybe it doesn't, and that's fine too. They're reading, let them read. There is a study by Joanne, and I'm going to try not to butcher her name, Uji, I believe is how it's pronounced, and Stephen Krashen, who's a reading specialist. And it's kids who read uh, more comic books. I'm sorry, kids who read comic books did more pleasure reading. They liked to read more, and they tended to read more books overall. So when people wonder, again, the benefit that they're getting is that it can increase reading, and not just reading of this particular format, it can increase reading overall, rather than the arguments that say that, it inhibits other kinds of reading. Again, the argument about different kinds of reading, I think that's a separate one, but this is, there is proof in research that that is not happening at all, is that it's not inhibiting different kinds of reading, and it can uh, facilitate what people often term as like real reading or heavier reading or more serious reading, any of those terms. Clearly, it's not one that I buy into, given my scare quotes. But so again, even if that were the argument, there is proof in research that says that that is not the case. So our second benefit is that it strengthens knowledge and retention. I'm sorry, it strengthens knowledge retention and transference. So I talked about earlier that in order to make sense of something in a graphic format, in order to make sense of a comic, is that your brain has to not only receive the information that's being conveyed in the text, but also has to receive the information that's being conveyed in the pictures. And it has to combine those things in order to make sense of it. It's that marriage between words and text that really is magical. So because your brain has to do all of that to make sense of what it's encountering, is that there have been neurological experiments that have shown that that process, combining the text and the image, one, those things happen in two different parts of the brain. Your brain makes sense of text in one part and it makes sense of images in the other. And so pairing them leads to increased ability to remember both the text and the image. And so the reader is not only learning the material, but it also learns the material faster and better. And I have a whole, one of the resources I give you is called Why Comics, and it gives more information about not just benefits, 5 primary benefits, as well as some secondary benefits, but then also gives you more information about like the research and the studies that I'm talking about. And I didn't go into them in detail here. But just know that it strengthens the reader's ability to retain information and to transfer that information, not just to whatever that particular area was that they were doing, but also it'll show up in other areas that you're thinking of, is that it really is a transference of skills and not just the ability to remember something. So the third benefit that I was going to talk about is that reading comics increases critical thinking and the analytical skills. And again, sometimes you hear people say, they're like, I want my kid to read real books. I don't want them to just stare at the pictures. And if they're only staring at the pictures and not actually working to make sense of what they're seeing, okay, that is problematic. But chances are, if they're remembering and enjoying the story, that's not all they're doing. They are making sense of the information. And it's that it engages your brain in a different way than just text alone. It requires the reader to actively make meaning from the interplay of the text and images, because as I mentioned, that neither one carries the entire meaning by itself. And so you can't just read the words and understand what the story is about. You can't not fully understand what the story is about. You can't just look at the pictures and fully understand what's happening. You really have to make those items work together in order to get the full meaning of what's being conveyed. Um, the other thing you see happening is that the brain is working in like multiple directions and multiple levels. And so in order to fully understand the information that's being conveyed, the reader has to process things sequentially. So you're reading across the page, you're seeing things happen from panel to panel, and you're figuring out in time sequence, but then also simultaneously, because sometimes it's not always an action one after the other. It may be happening at the same time. Then they're also having to read across panels as well as across pages. And so you're working simultaneously as well as sequentially within panels as well as across panels and within and across pages. That's several different levels on which you're having to think to make meaning. This is not a simplistic process. It is definitely complex, and it's requiring, those higher level thinking skills, those analytical skills. The other things you think of as the analyzing or analysis of comics strengthens, again, those critical thinking skills. It requires the reader to use those higher level thinking. So things such as inferencing, because not everything is concrete, not everything is clearly spelled out. They're having to make logical conclusions based upon the text that's in front of them as well as the visuals. And so they're having to make logical conclusions as to what caused things to happen, relationships that were had, motivations for characters, and to synthesize, so once they've made these inferences, they're now putting together all of the pieces to get a larger meaning. Sorry, I lost my track of what I was saying. So you're inferencing as well as those synthesis skills. And just again, the magic happens between the combination, the marriage of the text and the images. And so having to infer what's happening between those panels as well as across panels. They're also complex texts, and they include literary devices. You have metaphors, simile, personification, all those things, visually as well as text-based. There's a lot of symbolism. There's a lot of juxtaposition of images. A lot of times that indicates time. There's manipulation of time. Things happen in sequence, or sometimes they happen, simultaneously. There are multiple levels of meaning that really the reader has to decode in order to fully benefit from the experience. Also, reading comics requires visual literacy skills. And so these are the skills that like the reader is going to need for things like interpreting and evaluating images. So it could be elements of art or design, but also it's things like the ads that pop up on our phone all the time when you're looking at social media or whatever. When you open your phone, you open your browser, political cartoons. But if you think about all of the we have a very consumer driven culture, and all of the persuasive argumentation that comes to us, both text based, but then also visually, which is very, very effective. And you think about how scary it can be for a reader who, or maybe how scary it could be for the rest of us with readers who encounter this information and simply absorb all of that messaging without thinking about it critically, without breaking it down, without making sense of it, without deciding whether or not they truly want to buy into and act upon the messaging that's coming at them. You want readers who think critically. You want them to go through that process because you're looking at a visual format, you're looking at a graphic format. It's teaching them to do that in a fun way and reinforcing those skills and breaking that down and giving a safe environment to do so, as opposed to, I don't know, clicking on an ad and purchasing something. So, all right. So now, in light of the benefits, thinking about, the pushback, because we can talk about all the time how much you benefit from it, but a lot of times you still have those, like I said, those stakeholders, those community members who are like, I don't know, I'm not on board, and or possibly giving you grief about having them in the collection and why they should have any presence or real estate in the programming. So one thing we hear all the time is that comics aren't real reading, or or maybe it's not even said comics aren't real reading. And that's a whole different story. America has a long-standing history going back to World War II with how we perceive comics as not being real reading. They're trash reading, and they're potentially harmful. That hasn't always been the perception that we as a society have had, but it is the one that we have now, and that is the one that you are often having to have these conversations and work in light of. So we'll start with there. One of the things beyond the statement that comics is real reading, I like to point out to people when they say this, they're like, I want my kid to be reading real stories. Well, comics, not always, but many times they're narratives, whether they're fiction or nonfiction. Many times they're narratives, they're stories. And so just like prose stories, they have those same elements that we're used to looking for in them. We're used to seeing there. They have plot, they have characters, they have themes, they have setting, they have point of view. Like I said earlier, you have juxtaposition of images, you have manipulation of time, there's a lot of symbolism. All of those elements that you see in narratives that we traditionally think of being in narratives that are present and add to the ability to think critically about the information presented are also present in comics. Primary difference is much of the information, much of the story is told not just in text, but also visually. And as we said, there's benefit to that. As far as it, what it does for the brain or what it requires the brain to do, building that skill. But they are narratives, they are stories, just like anything else. And because your brain is having to make meaning by, to construct meaning with both the words and the images, you're forced to use both sides of your brain. As I mentioned earlier, making meaning with text and making meaning with images happen in two different parts of the brain. It is a slight oversimplification, but if you think about the two different lobes of the brain, one happens in one happens in the other, which means when you're reading something in a comics format or a graphic format, because it requires you to activate both, you're using the entire brain, whereas just reading prose doesn't do that for you. And as I mentioned earlier, comics help build this visual literacy. And so things like the arts, advertisements, memes, political cartoons, infographics, those things that are generally thought of as being elevated text or the kind of things we want our kids to be able to read and understand and make sense of in this world. This is training ground for being able to consume those. And consume them critically. All right, so another argument, and I've had a librarian tell me that she does this all the time. One of the things she likes to do is she will ask whomever it is, whether it's a coworker, whether it's a community member, well, co-workers are community members, but whether it's someone outside of the library staff community, ask them, have you read one? And I'm sure you've experienced this before too, is that many times the pushback we get about things we have in the collection, people haven't actually read one. And so she turns this into an opportunity for reader advisory in order to help sway that opinion. And so pointing out that comics are, a format, not a genre, Being aware of that means it opens your mind to the fact that they can manifest in any genre or type that you might be interested in. So at that point, what sort of things does that person like to read? How do they like to consume information? So if they're into romances, you know what? There are comics for that. If you're into superheroes, there are clearly comics for that. If you're interested in nonfiction, there are comics for that. If you're interested in expository information, there's a whole suite that I love that says, I'm trying to remember what it's called, the Comics Guide to whatever, and there are various academic subjects. So there's the Comics Guide to physiology, the Comics Guide to trigonometry, the Comics Guide to what have you. I think there's also a graphic guide series as well, the manga series as well. So whatever type of reading the person does like to read, help connect them to a comic in that form. Now, in order for this to work, it does mean you have to have a pretty extensive collection that you can reference, or you have some ways to think about like, okay, I can find this book. We may not have it personally, or we may not have it in our library, but I can suggest that you can read it. I can help you get connected to it. But just know that like you have to have a pretty decent repository of resources right there at your fingertips in order for this one to work. But just showing them that maybe the way that they've always conceptualized comics before now is not an accurate representation, and that there's so much more out there, and to be open to that experience. And they're far more likely to be open to that experience when it comes in the form of something they're already interested in reading. We do it all the time. It's like, I don't know, give me a topic about something I'm interested in. I'm far more likely to be engaged with it and even push through if I find it a little difficult than I am with something I'm completely uninterested in. So another point to help counter pushback is, and again, another librarian told me this is one that she likes to do all the time, is that she will point out to library patrons that she can't keep them on the shelf and just how popular they are. Literally, she will walk over to wherever she has, the comics collection in her library, and will point out like its current state of disrepair. Like, it looks like a whirlwind has come through because they move so quickly, they circulate so much, they haven't had the opportunity to straighten the shelves and to keep them straightened and read and all of that. And to read your shelves, because people are just, they're coming in to look and see what's there, and they're going through it, and there's a lot of turnover. We'll also point out that this is, there's a high return on investment for these books if you're bringing them into your collection and they're going through that quickly. And I think our last comment is kind of closing it out, is just pointing out and like, this is literally your tax dollar at work. This is how the money that the community contributes to this collections and services, this is how it's being spent, and it's clearly being used. You can take it to other parts of the library, although I don't necessarily recommend it, but you could take it to other parts of the library, and like this area over here, pristine. I never even need to read the shelves because nobody ever checks them out. You could probably knock the dust off of it, but so just showing them how much this is used and loved. And that's the other thing. She will walk over and pick up a book, and she will show, how worn the spine is, how much the pages have been turned. Like, these are not items that are just sitting on the shelves and being observed at best. Like, these are working titles. They are moving in the collection, and they are well loved. So those are some suggestions for pushback. And from what I can see, no one has asked a question yet, but I'm going to pause briefly because I know I've been talking quite a bit, to see if we have any questions immediately before I kind of move on to talk about selection aids. Oops, there we go. Any questions? Okay, I'm going to go on and talk. I'm going to talk about selection aids. Please stop me if I have missed something. So, all right, there we go. All right. So I will say that because comics and graphic novels and manga, things in a graphic format have been on the rise, finding tools that we traditionally use to help us make informed decisions about acquisition, about what we're putting in our collection, is not nearly as difficult as it used to be. So a lot of those traditional tools that you're used to using will work in this case too. You may just have to use their filtering tools to look for comics, to look for manga. But if you are struggling, because many times you can, especially when you get to kind of a critical mass with your collection, you can't hit a wall. And it's like, okay, all those traditional things aren't quite working for me anymore. There's still a lot out there, but I don't know how to separate the wheat from the chaff. How do I find the really good stuff that is meeting my community's needs? So here are about 4 different types of selection aids that I recommend. The first one, give me a second. I'm struggling at this moment to see. Okay. This is not what I was looking for. Give me just a second. Why am I not finding the information I want? Okay. So the first thing I recommend is knowing your collection. So think about the things that circulate as well as the things that don't circulate, the things that are requested. Remember, we talked about earlier that comics can come in any form and any type. So the same kinds of things that circulate well now or that don't circulate well now might be a good source of where you want to look at looking for things in a graphic format to give them another option for consuming that same kind of information. Also, what sort of things are requested? So kind of when you're assessing your collection and you're auditing it, think about where those gaps. Can some of those gaps, as far as what's being carried to meet your community's needs, could they be filled by finding something in a graphic format? As you look at those things, you do, of course, have to think about availability. Again, like I said, this is better than it used to be. This is better than it was probably 5 years ago. But availability and durability are going to play a part. Comics as we know them, have a history that's rooted in kind of serials. You think about like superhero comics or something that came out volume 1, volume 2, volume 52, that came out every week. Obviously, those are not designed to do well in a circulating library. But and not everything has been collected into a binding that can withstand that. Sometimes there are to varying degrees. So just looking at availability of things as well as durability. When you're talking about manga, again, availability is huge. Since manga is rooted in Japanese culture, it's extensive in Japan. I can't even get into all of that. But what we see here in America, what makes its way here and we're able to purchase, and then add to the layer on that, what we're able to purchase in a form that will withstand circulating, is a much smaller slice. It's a much more narrow band. So just availability and its ability to stand up, because just thinking about your budget and how much, how often you'll be able to replenish things. Also thinking about, is this particular text or series or what have you, is it bringing value to your collection? So thinking about, does it support the curriculum? Specifically, that's important if you're in a school library, but it may also be quite important in your public library as well. If your library has a close relationship with the school, or if you know that many times your local school children will come looking for books when their school library no longer has a copy that they can check out, or if you have a strong homeschool community. I'm trying to think of any number of reasons why supporting the curriculum may still play a role in what you put in your collection. Also, does it have artistic and literary merit? Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it brings something else, but these are just things for you to consider. Again, does it serve specific segments of your community? There are, I guess when we start talking about what's on the horizon, kind of what to keep an eye out for, one of the things I've seen is a lot of kind of, I don't want to call them specialty, but maybe niche areas that you would not have considered before would be a source of comic content or graphic content. But I'm seeing a lot of those. So especially when we start talking about bibliotherapy, that might be something to think of. You know, is there a segment of your community that isn't being served by other formats? Could this be an option? Also, of course, I would recommend looking for accolades. You can look and see, does a title appear on a word list, on a award list? And I will give you, I have several listed in the resources, but I will also tell you my favorite as we're talking about a little bit later. Sorry, does it appear on a award list? Is it well recommended and by whom? And so does it have a good reputation based upon its creator or its publisher? That can lead you astray, but then again, so can anything. But at least it's something to consider as you're looking at all of these different factors. Oh, sorry. The last point I want to make too is just kind of free your mind, being mindful of your personal biases and how that can transform acts of selection into censorship, that we can self-censor because we think that it isn't appropriate to have in our collection, or that our community may not receive it well. But then again, there may be parts of your community that need to see it there. So just kind of taking all those into account as you make decisions for what you want to put in your collection. All right, so oh here we go. I apologize, skipping around too much. Here we go. So just some things to keep an eye out for as far as what is coming up on the horizon. Like I said earlier, mentioning Barbies, I said you can always be chasing that what's new and what's shiny. And so rather than kind of directing you towards specific titles, I'm going to point out some things that I've seen that are trending right now, as well as some selection tools that will help you make informed decisions. Because that would change, is that I could give this presentation a year from now and like the titles that I mentioned could change. So these are kind of more the idea of like teaching you how to fish as opposed to, supplying you with some fish. So I've seen a lot of really amazing things happening recently with graphic nonfiction. I'm not a huge nonfiction reader myself, but I will say that most often now, when I do read nonfiction, I prefer to read it in a graphic format. And so some of the things I've seen, growing popularity is one, this idea of graphic medicine. And so the accepted definition of graphic medicine is it's the intersection between the medium of comics and the discourse of healthcare. And that's really broad and that's fantastic. So it could be everything from an expository text that specifically talks about a health condition that a person might have, or it could be a narrative, whether it is autobiographical or completely a work of fiction that focuses on some sort of health condition. It can expand so many different things. But again, that speaks to the idea that comics can show up in any genre in any format. So graphic medicine is really hot, and I've seen a lot of really amazing things coming out of there. Kind of similarly, but not not exactly the same. I kind of think of it more kind of set and subset, although I haven't quite decided which one's actually the broader category. This idea of bibliotherapy. And so this is a growing trend, and it's the idea of it's like a therapeutic approach to kind of healthcare that uses literature to support good mental health. Um, I am not an expert in this area, but I have been asked before to recommend comics or graphic format that deal with specific topics that might appeal to someone as they're looking at bibliotherapy. So that's a whole field in and of itself. But I have seen that happening. And again, a lot of nonfiction works are going to support this practice. Also, just not expository nonfiction, probably my least favorite kind of nonfiction, but that's just my personal taste. There are plenty of people that love this and freaking eat it up. And I've seen, I think, 3 authors that I've seen are really prolific and execute this well. One is Don Brown. Don Brown tends to do a lot of current and modern issues and events. The thing that comes to my mind most is I know he has a comic called Drowned City, that it's about Katrina and it's about New Orleans, the city of New Orleans, and Hurricane Katrina. Also, Guy Delisle, he does, I'm trying to think what is, I can't think of the title that his that I wanted right now, but he does some more kind of current events. I want to say his is he's written Pyongyang, and I don't know why the other titles are escaping me at this moment, but his expository nonfiction is really good. And then Joe Sacco, and Joe Sacco is a graphic journalist. His work is a little bit more gritty, so I won't recommend that casually. It'll definitely make you think, but then also it might, it'll definitely make you think. So for the good and for the bad. And so a lot of what he does is he is doing first-hand accounts covering parts of the world where unfortunately things have gone terribly wrong. So those are some things that I'm seeing trending. As far as selection tools that can help you stay current and keep up with what's happening. Again, I mentioned award lists, and I'm just going to give you kind of my favorites in these areas. So award lists, the 2 that I recommend most often are the Texas Maverick graphic novel reading list, as well as its sister list. And not just because I'm an alumna of the Texas Maverick list, although I will say that definitely plays a big part of it. But the other thing is that between the 2 lists, the Little Mavericks and the Maverick list, is that you're looking at selection tools that cover everything for readers that are targeting, ranging from kindergarten through adult for YA. And so I really appreciate that. Whatever form youth services look like, whether you're a children's librarian or a teen librarian, or maybe you're having to serve the entire area of youth services, between those 2 lists, you're covered for school-age children from kindergarten all the way through high school. Even what they call adult for YA. So these are things that are targeting adults, but would be appropriate for a young adult, for a reader of young adult material. Also, and this is one that I guess I kind of stumbled across, somebody pointed out to me and I was like, this is fantastic. So your distributors, wholesalers, your vendors, oftentimes they have newsletters, and their newsletters often have digital arcs. Now, knowing what we know, they're trying to sell you something. They're going to put in front of you what they are promoting, but it's also an opportunity that something is put in front of you so that you're not having to sift through the sea of infinite possibility and find stuff on your own. This is one way of encountering new titles and what's coming out and getting the opportunity to read it and interact with it so that you can make decisions. Also the sorting tools that they have built in. So one of my favorite is using, Tidal Wave by Follett. And so their sorting tools I've found are not quite as great as Mackin's. However, what Follett does really well is their tagging system is very nice. And so from a school library or an educator's perspective, it tags it with curriculum tags, which are very nice because you're like, okay, this title helps support this. Content that you want to put in front of students, but also tags it kind of, I guess, think of more as content tags, not necessarily curriculum, not necessarily like history or you're teaching social emotional learning. Things that are more, I'm trying to think what the word is I want. I'm just going to stick with content tags. And so you would have things, they say things like telling you that characters in this, like your primary character might be African American or might be Asian and Pacific, Islander heritage, or might be a member of the LGBTQIA plus community. So there are a lot of different kind of tagging that can happen. So as you're thinking about, like I said, your community and what needs you have in your collection and gaps, there's information there that can let you know this is a potential for helping to meet those gaps. Also, I like using, and I don't have a good name for these, I've kind of said communities and platforms, but thinking about reading and recommendation communities or reading platforms. So whether you're talking about things like NetGalley or Edelweiss, or whether you're looking at like Hoopla or, just your online platforms, these can be a good source. Obviously, these are going to be published titles as opposed to ARCs that are coming out. But NetGalley and Edelweiss are going to be a good source of digital ARCs. And so that's one way to check out things that have not been published yet and may be a good source for you. But like Hoopla and Libby or Overdrive, those could be a source. So look and see about like the suggested kind of read alike sort of things. Change your filters to say that you're interested in comics and graphic novels and manga, and look and see about those reading recommendation engines. That's a great way to at least introduce you to topics that you might want to further explore. Also, again, with websites, there are some fantastic things, resources happening online. The two that I recommend, in addition to sites that are run by library workers themselves, two that I recommend looking at are No Flying, No Tights and Pop Culture Classroom. So there's some really good things happening there. And again, like I said, there's some amazing things regarding manga. So I felt like I've been talking a lot. This kind of brings me to the end. I've given you a primer, some basic information. How can I help you at this point? What questions do you have for me? I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that I can see you more quickly and we can actually talk at this point. The last thing I want to do before I stop sharing my screen is I'm going to put back up briefly the very first slide. So if you missed the URL, you can see that. I'll give you about a minute if you need to get that information, then I'll stop sharing.